You've just landed in a new city, you're dragging your suitcase, and you walk into this. A chaotic maze of platforms, announcements in a language you don't even recognize, and thousands of people rushing in every direction. Your heart starts pounding, your palms get a little sweaty, and one single thought floods your mind. Am I going to miss my train?
Oh, that panic is so real. It's a feeling every traveler knows. It's that moment when your exciting adventure suddenly feels like a pop quiz you are definitely not ready for. The spinning departure boards look like they're in an alien language. Every platform seems a mile away, and you're just convinced you're about to end up on a 12-hour journey in the completely wrong direction. It's almost enough to make you want to give up and just live in the station's coffee shop forever.
But what if it didn't have to be like that? What if we told you that you could walk into any train station on Earth, no matter how big or busy, and navigate it with the cool confidence of a seasoned pro? What if you knew the secrets to making all that chaos work for you, instead of against you?
Well, stick around, because we're about to share the strategies that make that happen. We're giving you a complete playbook, learned from years of our own train travel wins and fails, that will turn even the scariest terminal into a place you can totally conquer.
Hi everyone, I'm Adam. For the better part of a decade, I've been the person who geeks out over planning complex multi-country train trips. I love digging into timetables, station layouts, and finding the absolute most efficient way to get from A to B. For me, the journey starts way before I even get to the station. It starts with a rock-solid plan.
And I'm Jessica. If Adam is the architect, I'm the on the ground explorer. I've spent years traveling solo, a lot of the time deciding my next stop on a whim. I've been stuck in Tokyo's Shinjuku station during peak rush hour. I've had to deal with last minute platform changes during a rail strike in France, and I've learned firsthand that sometimes even the best plans go completely sideways. My thing is adapting, improvising, and knowing the unwritten rules of the rails.
And together, we've combined our two styles, the meticulous planner and the adaptable explorer, to build the ultimate guide. Forget the stress. Forget the confusion. Today, we're teaching you how to travel like a pro. We've broken it all down into 7 essential strategies that will completely change your next train journey. Our first and maybe most important strategy happens before you even think about packing. We call it pre-trip recon. So many travelers just show up to a huge, unfamiliar station and hope for the best, which is honestly a recipe for stress. A pro treats it like a mission. You gather your intel first. This means getting to know your station online before you ever set foot in it.
Exactly. And your best friend here is your smartphone. Start with the basics: Google Maps and City Mapper. But don't just use them for directions to the station. Switch to satellite and street view to look at the station's exterior. Where are the main entrances? Is the taxi stand right out front, or is it a 5-minute walk away? Just knowing the layout of the entrance can save you critical minutes when you show up with all your luggage.
Then, you go a little deeper. Most major train stations have their own websites, and if you poke around, you can often find a downloadable PDF map of the station layout. This is absolute gold. Download it straight to your phone. Before you travel, just take 5 minutes to look at it. I always try to identify what I call the 4 key pillars of any station: the main ticket office, the information desk, luggage storage, and of course, the bathrooms. Knowing the general area of these four things gives you an incredible sense of control when you arrive.
I can't even tell you how many times this has saved me. I remember arriving at Gare du Nord in Paris for the first time. It is huge, it's on multiple levels, and it is pure chaos. But because I'd spent maybe 3 minutes looking at a map beforehand, I knew the international ticket office I needed was on the upper level, off to the side. While I saw everyone else frantically looking at signs from the main floor, I knew exactly which escalator to take. It's such a small thing, but it completely shifts your mindset from panicked to purposeful.
And beyond just the station map, you should also download the app for the actual train company you're using. Whether it's Deutsche Bahn in Germany, Trenitalia in Italy, or Amtrak in the US, their official app is your direct line to the most accurate real-time info. This is usually where you'll see the fastest updates on delays or platform changes, sometimes even before they pop up on the big boards in the station.
Okay, that brings us to our next tip, which is a classic piece of travel advice that really needs a modern update: the 30-minute arrival rule. You've probably heard it a million times. Get to the station 30 minutes before your train leaves. And look, for a normal journey in a normal-sized station, that's a pretty decent rule of thumb. It gives you a nice, comfortable buffer.
And the point of that buffer isn't just about catching your train, it's about eliminating the rush. 30 minutes means you can walk, not sprint. It gives you time to handle a surprisingly long line at the ticket machine, to find your platform without panicking, to grab a bottle of water, and to get on the train feeling calm. Travel is supposed to be fun, and sprinting through a crowded station is the exact opposite of fun.
But, and this is the pro move, you have to know when to break that rule. The 30-minute rule is not one size fits all. If you're leaving from a massive, world-class hub like Tokyo's Shinjuku, Berlin's Hauptbahnhof, or New York's Grand Central, 30 minutes is cutting it way too close. For these monsters, I'd suggest a 45 to 60-minute buffer. These stations are basically mini-cities, and it can easily take you 15 minutes just to walk from the entrance to your platform.
And on the flip side, if you're grabbing a local train from a tiny two-platform station in the countryside where you can see the entire place from the front door, 30 minutes is total overkill. 10 to 15 minutes is probably fine. The key is to tweak the rule based on the size of the station and how complex your journey is.
And you have to factor in your own situation. Are you traveling with kids? Add 15 minutes. Got huge, heavy bags? Add 10 minutes. Do you still need to buy your ticket or get a rail pass validated at a counter? That's a big one. Definitely add at least another 20 minutes for the lines. A pro doesn't just follow a rule blindly, they adapt it. Arriving an hour early and chilling with a coffee is a travel luxury. Arriving with 5 minutes to spare and having to dive onto a moving train is a travel nightmare.
Okay, so you've arrived with time to spare, and you're standing in the main concourse. In front of you is the heart of the station, the main departures board. To a beginner, it's a terrifying wall of information. To a pro, it's the Rosetta Stone for your entire journey. Let's break down how to actually read it.
Right. So your eyes will naturally go to the time and the destination. That's where everybody starts. You see your 10:30 train to Vienna, and you breathe a little sigh of relief. But the pro move is to ignore the destination for a second and find the single most important piece of information on that entire board: the train number.
This is so important. In big European stations, it's actually pretty common for two trains to be leaving for the same city within a few minutes of each other. But one might be the high-speed express that gets you there in 2 hours, and the other might be a slow regional train with 25 stops that takes 5 hours. Your ticket is for a specific train service, and that is identified by its unique number, like ICE 702 or EC 173. Always, always, always match the train number on your ticket to the train number on the board. It's the best way to guarantee you get on the right train.
Once you've matched your train number, then you can look across the row. You'll see the departure time, the final destination, and usually a list of major stops. Just scan that list to make sure it looks right, and then you'll see the column you've been waiting for, the platform number.
But what happens when that column is blank? Or it says, "To be announced." This is where you see people start to get nervous, but the pros know this is totally normal. For a lot of long-distance trains, the platform is only announced 15 or 20 minutes before departure to help control crowd flow. The strategy here isn't to just stand there staring at the main board. Instead, look at the other trains leaving around your time. See a pattern? A lot of the time, trains to a certain region will depart from a specific group of platforms, like platforms 12 through 18. Position yourself in the middle of the station, with a good view of a smaller screen, so you can move quickly once that platform number drops.
Hey, quick pause. If you're finding these tips useful and you're already feeling a little more confident about your next trip, do us a huge favor and hit that like button and subscribe. We put out practical travel guides just like this every single week to help you travel smarter. Okay, now back to making you a train station master. All right, you have your platform number. The average traveler thinks their work is done. They just wander onto the platform and stand wherever. But the pro knows there's one more level to this: platform positioning. This is all about being smart about where you stand on the platform, and it can be the difference between a chaotic boarding and a totally smooth one.
The first thing you should do is look for a train composition chart. In so many stations across Europe and Asia, you'll find a diagram on the platform that shows the exact layout of the train that's coming. It'll show you which car numbers will stop in which section of the platform, usually marked with letters like A, B, C, and D. Your ticket has your car and seat number on it. Just match your ticket to this chart, and you can walk to the exact spot on the platform where your door will open. It is the ultimate pro move. You'll be just standing there calmly while everyone else is running up and down the platform trying to find their car.
But what if there's no chart, or you just have a general ticket with no reserved seat? There's still a strategy. Most people just naturally cluster near the entrance to the platform, right in the middle. So, to find a less crowded car and have a better chance at a good seat, do the exact opposite. Walk all the way to the very front or the very back of the platform. The end cars are almost always emptier. It's a simple trick, and it works a surprising amount of the time.
This also applies if you have big bags. It really pays to know where the luggage storage areas are inside the car. They're often at the very end. By positioning yourself right on the platform, you can get on board right next to the luggage rack, drop your bags, and then find your seat instead of dragging a giant suitcase down a narrow, crowded aisle while bumping into everyone.
And one last point on positioning. Think about your exit. If you know you have a tight connection at your next stop, check your car number. Lower numbers are often at the front of the train, higher numbers at the back. Knowing which end of the train you're on helps you plan your escape route through the next station before you even get there.
And that brings us to one of the biggest sources of travel anxiety out there, making a connection. That fear that your first train will be delayed and you'll miss the next one is very real. But pros manage this risk with a bit of planning and some quick thinking.
The first step is just being realistic when you book. A lot of booking websites will offer you connections with a minimum connection time of just like 8 or 10 minutes. And while that might be technically possible in a tiny station, it is a terrible idea. I have a personal rule. I never book a connection with less than 20 minutes to transfer, and if it's a big station I don't know, I aim for 30. A tiny 5-minute delay on your first train can completely destroy a 10-minute connection. Give yourself a buffer. It's the best insurance policy you can buy.
This is another place where that pre-trip recon pays off big time. If you already know that you need to get from Platform 2 to Platform 18, and you've already seen on the station map that it involves going down an escalator, through a long tunnel, and up another flight of stairs, you'll know you need more time. You can walk through it in your head before you even arrive.
But okay, let's say the worst happens. Your train is super delayed and you know you're going to miss your connection. What do? Rule number 1, don't panic. Rule number 2, find an official staff member. In many parts of the world, especially in Europe, there are passenger rights agreements. If you miss a connection because your first train from the same company was late, they generally have to get you on the next available train to your destination at no extra cost.
The key is to be proactive. As soon as you know you're going to miss it, try to talk to the conductor on your delayed train. They can often give you a little slip confirming the delay or tell you what to do. When you arrive, go straight to the main ticket office or the information desk. Don't just jump on the next train. Explain what happened, show them your original tickets, and they will officially rebook you. It's a process, but it works.
Our apps and phones are amazing. They've made travel so much easier. But tech fails. Batteries die, websites go down, apps glitch. And in those moments, you have to fall back on the most reliable travel tool ever invented: another human being. Knowing who to ask and how to ask is a skill every pro traveler has mastered.
And the trick is finding the right human. Don't just stop anyone in a uniform. They might be a security guard or a cleaner who has no idea about train schedules. Your best bet, always, is the clearly marked information desk. The staff there are literally paid to answer your questions. Your second best option is the main ticket office, and if you're already on the platform, look for a uniformed conductor or platform manager. They have the most up-to-the-minute info.
So, what about language barriers? This can feel intimidating, but you can usually get through it. First, always be polite and friendly. A smile goes a long way. Second, be prepared. Have your ticket in your hand so you can just point to your destination and train number. Instead of trying to ask a complicated question, just use key words. Point at your ticket and ask, "This train, which platform?" It's direct, and it almost always works.
A fantastic backup is to have the information ready on your phone. Take a screenshot of your destination written in the local language. You can use Google Translate before you even leave your hotel. That way, you can just show the screen to a staff member. It cuts through any pronunciation problems. I once had to get to a station in Poland with a name that I absolutely could not pronounce. I just showed the name on my phone, and the ticket agent understood immediately. It's a simple trick, but it's so effective. All right, you did it. You navigated the station, you found your platform, you boarded the right train, and you're sinking into your seat. Mission accomplished. Almost. The final step is mastering a little onboard etiquette so you can enjoy the ride without being that person who annoys everyone around them.
Let's start with the big one: luggage. Seats are for butts, not for bags. Use the overhead racks for your backpack and coat. For your big suitcases, use the dedicated luggage storage areas you'll find at the ends of each car. Don't block the aisles or take up an empty seat with your stuff, especially on a crowded train. It's just about being aware of the space you're sharing.
Next up, noise. A train is a shared public space, so keep your conversations at a reasonable level. If you have to take a phone call, keep it short and quiet. And for music, podcasts, or movies, headphones are absolutely non-negotiable. It seems obvious, but you would be surprised. Also, keep an eye out for signs for quiet cars. In these cars, all phone calls and loud conversations are banned. They're a sanctuary, so respect the silence.
Let's talk food. On most long-distance trains, bringing your own food and drinks is totally fine. But be thoughtful. A sandwich or a salad is great. A giant steaming container of something with a very strong aroma is not so great. A good rule of thumb is, if it has a powerful, lingering smell, maybe save it for later. And of course, always clean up after yourself. Leave your space as clean as you found it, or maybe even a little cleaner.
And finally, a quick word on seats. If you have a reserved seat, make sure you're in it. Double-check your car and seat number. If you don't have a reservation and you sit in an empty seat, just be aware that someone with a ticket for that seat might get on at a later stop. If they show up, you have to move, no questions asked. And keep your ticket handy, because the conductor will come by to check it. So there you have it, our 7 strategies to master any train station. It really all boils down to a simple philosophy. Be prepared, be aware, and be considerate. Do your recon ahead of time. Give yourself a real-time buffer. Learn to read the departures board and always check your train number. Use positioning to board smoothly. Know how to handle delays without panicking. Remember that asking a person for help is a smart move, not a weak one. And finally, be a good neighbor on board.
If you take these strategies to heart, the whole feeling of train travel just changes. That chaos and anxiety we talked about in the beginning, it just melts away. It gets replaced by this calm confidence. The station is no longer this scary obstacle. It becomes an interesting, manageable part of your adventure. You stop being a tourist, hoping for good luck, and become a savvy traveler who knows exactly how the system works.
We really hope this guide helps you out on your next trip. Now we'd love to hear from you. What is the biggest, most confusing, or most chaotic train station you've ever been in? Share your stories in the comments below. We love reading them.
And if you want more guides to help you travel smarter, make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell turned on. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Safe travels.